Hello and welcome to this special conversation. Today we have with us the Secretary-General of the United Nations, Mr. Antonio Guterres. Thank you so much for first of all agreeing to having this conversation with us, and welcome to India.
Great pleasure.
Thank you. So I would begin by asking you about the G20 Summit. I mean, it's here, and it would be great to know your expectations from this global event.
Now, first of all, I think we need to recognize that India has played a very important role in making sure that the voice of the Global South was heard in this summit and that the development agenda was put in its center. Of course, one thing India cannot guarantee is that the G20 members will be able to fully correspond to the ambition that the President has put on the table. But I want to pay tribute to India for these efforts. And obviously, now it depends on member states. For me, there are two things that are crucial at the present moment. One, we need to look into a very unequal world. Developing countries, many of them, are in debt distress. They have no fiscal space to address the basic needs of their people, much less to implement sustainable development goals. Inequalities are growing. This needs to be addressed. That is why we have been strongly advocating for the reform of international financial architecture and for serious measures of debt relief, for a much broader redistribution of special drawing rights, for capitalization of the multilateral development banks, and changing their business model to be able to much more leverage private finance at reasonable cost to developing countries. A number of things that we believe would be needed to make our world more based on equity and justice, and developing countries to have a chance. And then the second point is climate. And in climate we need ambition in two dimensions. One is to reduce emissions. Things are getting out of control. And we see the devastating impact, especially in countries of the Global South. 17 of the 20 worst hotspots are in Africa. And in India, I know that many people have suffered enormously with drought in the recent past. But we also need climate justice. And so it's very important that developed countries assume their responsibilities in support to developing countries, as it was promised in different situations. And it is essential that, according to their different levels of responsibility, there is a principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, but according to the different levels of all countries make a much bigger effort to reduce emissions, and developed countries support financial and in a technological way emerging economies for all to be able to reduce emissions. Because if we don't reduce emissions, we are moving into a catastrophic situation.
How do you see India's contribution as the world's largest developing country in contributing to the fulfillment of the SDG targets?
I see India strongly committed to be a voice on behalf of the developing world, and I see India strongly committing in making sure that development is not forgotten in the international agenda. Look, we have the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the war, and in many areas, in many fora, what we see is that the war is making people forget many other things. But the fact is that the war has terrible consequences, and especially for developing countries in the world. And so, independently of the fact that we have a war, and it's a problem that needs to be solved, we need to make sure that the development issues are put high in the agenda of the international organizations. And this is something that India has managed in the G20 Summit, and I hope India will be very active in making the same in the different initiatives that the UN will be developing. We have the SDG Summit, the Summit of the Sustainable Development Goals, we'll have a Summit on Finance, we'll have on Climate Ambition, and then the Summit of the Future next year, in which we hope that many of the reforms that are needed to have a strengthened multilateralism able to respond to the dramatic challenges that we face will be achieved.
India, as the world's most populous country and the largest democracy, has made abiding contributions to the UN systems since its inception. So what is your view on UN Security Council reforms, and where do you see India's chances of realistically becoming a permanent member in an expanded United Nations Security Council?
It's not for me to define who will be or who should be in the Security Council. That's for member states. But I believe that what we need is to have a Security Council that represents today's world. The present composition of the Security Council represents the world after the Second World War. Today's world is different. And as you mentioned, India is today the largest population country in the world. So I fully understand India's aspirations in this regard. Not for me to judge, it's for member states, but I believe, and I repeat, we need to adjust the composition of the Security Council to the realities of today's world. I'm sure that you know those realities quite well.
About the question of cross-border terrorism, India has been a victim of this for a long time. What, in your sense, can United Nations do in terms of collaborating with the member states in the fight against terror?
This is something that is very high in my priorities. The first reform I made when I came to the United Nations was exactly to create the Office of Counterterrorism. This was a kind of a forgotten area in the activities of the UN, and I thought, and I still believe, that this must be a fundamental priority for us all. Terrorism is the worst violation of human rights. Terrorism is absolutely unjustifiable. We can have in many circumstances grievances. We can have people that are unhappy for different reasons, or even victims of injustice, but terrorism is never the answer. Terrorism only amplifies the problems and the difficulties. And so the UN has now a program of cooperation with tens and tens of countries around the world to strengthen their capacity to respond to terrorist threats. And terrorism became a global phenomenon. India naturally has its own concerns, but I look, for instance, into the Sahel. You see terrorism spreading terribly in Africa. Terrorism is indeed something that we must seriously consider and must be a fundamental priority of the international system.
Question connected with this. India has been very vocal on the attempts being made to block the blacklisting of certain names which have been globally sanctioned as terrorists by some countries. What is your view on that?
No, there is a mechanism within the Security Council with the Committee of Experts, and this is something that should not be based on political considerations that, of course, are different from area to area. I think this should be done with solid technical expertise in order to be able to identify those that are terrorists and must suffer the corresponding sanction.
International Year of Millets, that India actually took the initiative to launch the International Year of Millets for 2023. And the UN General Assembly resolution to build a memorial wall to UN peacekeepers, which was passed with a record 190 co-sponsorship. So how do you view these two contributions of India in the UNGA in recent years?
Well, first of all, India has been a very strong participation in peacekeeping missions, and we are extremely grateful, especially in the moment where peacekeepers are in circumstances in areas where there is no peace to keep, and many of them pay with their lives the protection of civilians in very difficult circumstances. I think we need to pay tribute to all peacekeepers and to recognize that India has been a leading country in this regard. Now, food security is for us an essential concern. And what we are discovering is that there are many forgotten ways to solve problems of food security, and those forgotten ways are much better than what sometimes new technologies bring with things that compromise the equilibrium in nature. So I think the initiative on millet is a good way to demonstrate that we have the tools, we have the resources, we have the instruments to solve the problem of food security. We must need to learn with our own experience, with our own past, and to be able to take profit of that experience in order to use the best ways to make food security compatible with a green economy and food security compatible with the prosperity of communities, especially communities at the rural level.
Secretary-General, India's G20 presidency has been projected as one which has brought a renewed focus, renewed global focus on concerns and challenges being faced by the global south. So how do you see this? How do you see India's priorities, and what is your assessment about India's focus on global south?
They are a central question in today's world, as I mentioned. I mean, a large part of my own advocacy in recent times has been very strongly concentrated on how to address the dramatic inequalities in the world, how to reform international financial architecture, how to be able to mobilize resources with equity in today's world, to give developing countries the chance to provide to their own citizens the same developed countries are able to do. This is a central question. Reducing inequalities, creating opportunities for development of the countries of the South is a fundamental priority, not only for the well-being of their people, but for peace and security at the global level, and to rebuild trust. And to rebuild trust is today essential in a divided world like the one we are living in.
How is the UN addressing Ukraine-Russia conflict?
Well, unfortunately, it has not been possible to have any effective mediation for peace, and at the present moment this doesn't seem very likely to happen. And so the UN has essentially concentrated its efforts in mitigating the negative impacts in the world in general, in the developing world in particular. It was the questions relating to food security. As you know, it was the work of the International Agency of Atomic Energy in Zaporizhia to prevent what could be a catastrophic incident. And basically the idea, as we cannot unfortunately bring peace, let's try to reduce as much as possible the suffering caused by the war.
The UN Summit of the future next year, the future summit that you're planning, is seen as a sign-off on your personal legacy to the UN system. So as you are hopeful of delivering a UN that gives the global south its due in decision-making by the time of the SOTF?
Well, India has brought a number of issues to the agenda, namely in the preparation of the G20. Very probably many of them will not be immediately transformed into a reality. But this seed needs to grow, and the plants need to be born out of it, and I see the summit of the future as the moment for the seed to transform itself into a beautiful green plant like the ones we have in this room.